Our next session delves into the ambitious goal of artificial general intelligence. Venture capitalist Marc Andreessen joined Fei-Fei Li to explore how to build a flourishing, innovative ecosystem to achieve this safely. Marc Andreessen is a co-founder and general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, a prominent venture capital firm. Known for co-authoring Mosaic, the first widely used web browser, Andreessen has significantly influenced the technology landscape. His investments and insights into technology trends have shaped the growth of numerous startups, making him a key figure in the tech industry. So, please welcome Marc and Fei-Fei to the stage.
I'm very excited to be moderating a fireside chat with Marc, who has been a long-term friend and colleague for a while. And I don't know how much you heard about the bio of Marc. Marc needs no introduction. But what really strikes me is that you were at the dawn of the internet. You were part of the people that made the internet happen. And now we're at the dawn of AI. And of course, as an influential venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, what your firm is doing is very much in the middle of making AI happen. So another thing about Marc is that I think it was last year, you wrote a very influential techno-optimist manifesto that received a lot of notoriety from its firm belief that technological progress driven by free markets is essential for human advancement.
You said notoriety. You meant to say respect and approval.
I meant notoriety. Yes. So we're gonna get to that. But I do want to start by asking you this question, right? You have been a very vocal advocate about invigorating this ecosystem, about removing roadblocks and impediments, including limiting government's role, especially in regulation, and you believing AI, making AI happen, engendering AI will benefit society more broadly than if it's overly regulated. So we're here celebrating the 5th year of HAI. We're here smack in the middle of the latest Gen AI revolution. Expand on that. Share with us what you think.
Sure. Yeah. So first, it's great to be here. It's really great to see all the work that this institution's been doing for the last 5 years. So a couple things. So one is, look, I think it's really good that this conversation is happening. For a very long time, I'd say my first 20 years in Silicon Valley, we were basically just building tools, and then it's really only over the course of the last decade that I describe Silicon Valley with respect to politics and ethics and these sort of larger societal issues as a little bit like the dog that caught the bus, which is we developed all these tools. It turns out they actually really matter. And they really matter to society, and they really matter in the political system. And so I think it's great. And I think these are like very, very big, important questions. And I think it's great that these are the conversations that are happening. So my framing on this, I'll start with a story that sort of informs how I think about this. The basic, sort of simplified version of the conversation that happens today, and it's happened around social media for a long time and the internet, now it's happening around AI. Is sort of this story is sort of like, okay, there's this new thing, and is it going to be harmful or not? And if it's harmful, it needs to be controlled or regulated or stopped. And the sort of implicit, kind of basis for that conversation is something that in sort of technology ethics is called the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle is this basic, what seems like a very reasonable proposition that the inventors of technology should basically be able to forecast whether or not it will have negative effects, and if it does, they're responsible for stopping it, for not pursuing that technology and not deploying it. The precautionary principle has a very interesting origin. It comes from the 1970s, from the German Green Party, in response to the rise of the civilian nuclear power industry. And so, nuclear technology obviously emerged as a form of military technology in the 40s and 50s, and then as you head into the 50s and 60s, there was a big boom in civilian nuclear power and sort of the promise of unlimited energy from the atom. And in the 70s, the German Green Party basically rose up and decided to put a stop to it and created the precautionary principle and basically proposed, as long as the developers of civilian nuclear power can't prove that it's totally harmless in all circumstances, that its deployment should be stopped. And basically that worked. It stopped. In the U.S., that idea was adopted. In the year I was born, in 1971, President Nixon at the time proposed something he called Project Independence, which was a project to build 1,000 domestic nuclear power plants in the United States by 1980. It would have had the result of cutting the entire U.S. electric grid over to nuclear power. It would have had the result of completely disentangling us from the Middle East. It would have resulted in what we now know would have been basically completely clean, zero emission, zero carbon power for the country. It would have driven the transition to electric vehicles much faster. So Nixon proposed that, and then of course he created the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which then prevented that from happening. And we sit here today in the United States, and there are exactly 0 new nuclear power plants under development. And if you look at the deployment chart of civilian nuclear power over the course of the last 40 years, it basically just like completely stopped. This leads to many aspects of our current politics. For certainly anybody concerned about carbon emissions, climate, this is a giant missed opportunity, and the environmental movement, I would say just now is starting to wake up to the tragedy of what's happened, which is we have the silver bullet for zero emission energy, and we decided not to use it. It also, by the way, led to, among current events, it basically fueled what's happening right now with Russia and Ukraine. Germany, as a consequence of its decision to not deploy nuclear power, became very dependent on gas. As a consequence of that, became very dependent on Russia. So did the rest of the EU, and so the EU basically has been funding, the Putin regime for the last 20 years, and is still to this day essentially funding the war effort through energy purchases from Russia. And so we look back, and we're basically just like staggered, and we're just like, oh my God, how could they have made such a terrible set of mistakes, right? And then by the way, in the full accounting of civilian nuclear power over the course of the last 70 years, it's now like overwhelmingly clear it's the safest form of energy there is, with basically extremely small numbers of human deaths relative to any other kind of energy. And so it's like, well, how could we have possibly done that? And so for me, it's like, okay, well, let's maybe not do that again.
So you're seeing that danger in AI?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. So this is that it's basically the same dynamic. It's basically the same discussion.
Elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, so it's the same thing. So the presumption in the discussion is, okay, if there are potential harms, then therefore there should be regulation, there should be controls, there should be limitations, there should be, pauses, there should be stops, there should be freezes, a variety of different proposals. But it's sort of this overwhelmingly negative frame, this sort of risk aversion frame, which is very consistent with the precautionary principle, but it is the frame of the discussion.
Well, isn't the landscape a little more complex? If you look at the EO by President Biden that last year, right, there is the precautionary measures, but there is also the incentivization and the competitive angle, because geopolitics is very complex these days. So are you over-indexing on the aggressive push towards technology because you think the regulation is already too much, or are you just trying to call to action to more invigorating industrial effort?
Yeah. So to start with, to talk about the geopolitics for a second, because this is extremely important. So this is the other thing that I observe, at least in my discussions in DC in particular, and I've been spending a lot of time in DC recently. My firm was not involved in politics for a very long time. We tried very hard to be non-political, but there's an old Soviet joke that says, you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And so we, in the last year and a half, 2 years, have become very involved in DC, and AI is a big part of our push. This is the other really striking thing I'm glad you brought up, which is about the discussions in DC, which is basically there's a schizophrenia in the discussions in DC. And the way I would describe it is, if I go to DC on a Tuesday, the discussion is all about domestic policy, and it's about domestic regulation. And it's about the work that is happening in American companies, big tech companies, little tech companies, universities, and whether that work should be controlled or restrained or stopped. The conversation we started with. If I go back on Thursday and the conversation is China and geopolitics, it's a completely different conversation. And the conversation there is, oh my God, we have to win, right? And the conversation there is, China is on record, for the last decade of having declared that AI is a national strategic priority for China. It's a national, priority for their civilian, all their population control. Surveillance and social credit and all that stuff. It's a key component of their digital Belt and Road to proliferate the Chinese model of governance and technology broadly around the world, which is in competition with the U.S. US's ethos. And then it's also for the future of military And then, by the way, in the U.S. also, there's this concept in the Defense Department has, they call the offsets, which is AI and autonomy were declared some years back as being what's called the third offset, which is basically critical technology for national defense. And there's lots of implications of that with respect to how defense systems are getting made, and how the DoD will function, how wars will be fought in the future. And so there it's like, okay, now you have like a national arms race, like you have a national geopolitical competition happening that has strong implications for what happens inside the U.S. and China, what happens globally, and what happens militarily. There, the discussion is we have to win, and of course, those conversations are in direct conflict, right? Which is, do we basically put limitations, on the domestic conversation, do we put limitations on ourselves, such that we slow everything down and restrict it, and then on the geopolitical thing, it's like, oh no, we have to go full speed, we have to win. It may not surprise you to hear that people in DC do not view themselves as responsible for reconciling those two topics.
I thought that's what they do on Saturday.
One would hope. I would say, or I'd say, so far they have not reconciled those two topics, and I frankly think that means they're, just de facto they're leaving it up to us to figure that out.
Okay, well, let's just drill down on one of this, because both topics converge on one of the debates, which is the rigorous debate of open source. Right now, it's happening nationwide, and it's here in our home state of California. We're seeing actually troubling bills in our state Senate floor about regulating and controlling potentially open source. What is your view on this?
Yeah, so look, the open source discussion, is very interesting because it's describe it as like there's like the one-dimensional version or the one-step version, then there's a two-step version. And the one-step version is very consistent with the precautionary principle, and I think the current California bill kind of reflects this. The EU's AI Act, also reflects this, and I think the California bill is somewhat based on the EU's AI Act. Which again it's precautionary principle implemented in legislation, which is like, okay, this is presumed to be potentially harmful, and therefore it must be controlled to prevent the harms. And again, that all, this is the whole thing with the precautionary principle. This always sounds reasonable because how can you possibly argue against this? It is, though, important to then think about the second step, and particularly with respect to open source, is that second step gets to be, I would say, quite eye-watering in a heartbeat, right? Which is like, okay, well, what is open source? Well, it's software code. Right, and software code is this interesting thing where it's like sort of halfway between, it's something that's sort of halfway between speech and technology, right? It's like, I always describe writing software as it's a little bit like writing a novel and a little bit like designing a chemical formula, like kind of at the same time, right? And so, it is a form of expression. It is, there are lots of artistic, aesthetic, kind of aspects to it. But it's not just purely speech. It's not just like standing up and saying things. It also has functional, implications. So it's somewhere between, speech and technology. There's long-running debates over to what extent it qualifies under free speech protections. But it's kind of somewhere in that mix. And then, open source, or the original term, before that, free software, which is I can download it, I can look at it. It's a white box, not a black box. I can look inside it. I can modify it. I can learn from it. And so I think the second step you have to ask yourself is, okay, what kind of society would you need to design to have the enforcement mechanisms to enforce any kind of open source ban or limitation or restriction, right? And this is, and now you start to get into Orwell territory, right? Which is like, okay, and it's kind of, you always, kind of probe to see what people kind of have in mind on this. And the range of, kind of suggestions, are kind of, it kind of starts with, well, we, just need to put a software agent on every chip, to check to see if people are running unapproved open source, right? And right there, I'm like, okay, well, like, wait, hold on. Like, 1984 was not meant to be an instruction manual. Like, we were not meant to have like software agents running on all of our computers, just kind of in the first step. And then basically the policy prescriptions from there get increasingly horrifying. And, I think they really culminated in what I thought was actually a very honest articulation of where this takes you in Time Magazine. Eliezer Yudkowsky wrote a piece about a year ago in Time Magazine, which again, I really credit him for really, kind of sticking his beliefs and saying what he thought, which basically was, that basically to implement a ban on strong AI and on open source. Not only do you need to have pervasive surveillance to a degree that would make Orwell blush, you also need to enforce it globally. Because of course it's not sufficient to just ban it in the U.S., right? Because the 180 other countries you take into account. So you need to have a global ban, and of course you need to have enforcement for a global ban, and so therefore you need to be prepared to send the U.S. Air Force to bomb, rogue data centers. And he went so far as to say you need to be willing to risk nuclear war right? So you need to picture, U.S. stealth bombers, entering Chinese airspace or pick any other country and unilaterally bombing data centers. Like that's where this heads. And so you have to really ask yourself, okay, like what kind of society do you actually want to live in that would be able to enforce such a thing?
So that's enforcement.
Put me down, by the way, on the other side of that.
Right, that's enforcement. Can you talk about why do we need open source? Why is it you work with so many startups? That is part of Silicon Valley. Why is open source so important?
Yeah, so that'd be the other kind of way to come at this, which is like, okay, what role does open source play? Kind of independent of questions of like human freedom, which I think is important, and not having World War III, which I think is also important. The other is what role does open source play in the innovation ecosystem? And I'll just, you tell me. My view of this is basically there's a triangle of modern technology, of modern computer science, modern software, and it's basically open source. It's startups, which is my day job, and then it's academia. And I frankly think like basically if open source were to somehow get banned or restricted to a degree that would matter, first of all, I think just startups just die because every startup that we fund is basically built on open source. Everybody just takes it for granted. You can build on open source. Every new software project basically starts being built on open source, and so startups just fall over and die. And so another consequence of that direction, sort of step 2, step 3, is startups die. Therefore, basically all development is delegated to a cartel of big companies that are basically in power forever. Again, you want to like ask yourself if that's really the outcome you want. And then third is, you guys tell me, I think, basically academia dies. Certainly academic computer science dies. This institution dies. Like, I don't know what work happens here if there's no open source, because like...
We are also some of the biggest providers of open source software. Let's talk about academia, because part of your notoriety in your techno-optimist manifesto...
Sorry, fame and respect. Sorry.
Yes.
We'll settle on it.
So one of the things that I really appreciate, Marc, for over the years as friends is that we are intellectual friends who deeply respect each other but don't necessarily agree with each other. And I think it's actually thank you.
We do.
I actually think it's really, really important in this time of history on campus, in academia. And one thing that Hai has taken pride is given the platform to this kind of rigorous debate. And in fact, right after the break, you're going to hear a panel about regulation and so on. But in your manifesto, you actually use the word enemy. Mm-hmm. And connected to that word, you talk about ideas that are, that quote, tech ethics, trust and safety. At some point, it also connected to ivory tower. Mm-hmm. But you just said you care about academia, you care about the ecosystem, and I know you do. So how do you reconcile what you wrote there? What do you really mean? And what's your view about this historical moment for academia?
Yeah, so I'll start with when I use the word enemy, and I did this very specifically in my thing. I was to talk about ideas, not people, and so I don't think any of the people involved in any of these things. I don't view them as an enemy, but I do think there are bad ideas, and I do think we live in a time in which there are some bad ideas that have gotten to be very pervasive, and I think need to be challenged. I've already articulated.
So why is trust and safety in AI bad?
Because it gets hijacked. So it's the precautionary principle sort of implemented in the context of, it's specifically there as a company. So trust and safety, for those who people don't know, it's a term of art basically inside modern tech companies, and it's basically the group that basically is the internal. It's basically internal. It's the equivalent of internal affairs. Effectively, it's the group that sort of has implements sort of internal restrictions. And it sort of started with the internet companies. I think the first company that had a trusted safety group was eBay, which was sort of policing internet auctions. And of course, you need to have a police function. You're going to have an internet auction website. I remember when eBay started, and it just seemed like inconceivable that it could work at all, because how could anybody trust anybody? eBay turned out to work for two reasons. One is it turned out Pierre Omidyar believed that most people are good, and so most people would list legitimate products and engage in transactions. But he also believed it was important to have a function that was called trust and safety that was basically the police. And so if you buy something on eBay and it's fraudulent, you have somebody you can appeal to.
So that's a not hijacked version of trust.
Yeah, well, you need to have, it's absolutely necessary, right? You need to have that. And then sort of the phase two of that was with the social media companies, where, if you're going to provide a platform for people to, exchange information, I mean, look, even just on legal grounds, the First Amendment is not absolute. There's like 11 legal carve-outs to free speech, including incitement to violence and child pornography and terrorist recruitment and so forth. And so if you're going to have an online communications platform, you need to have you need to have a group that basically maintains and monitors and manages that. But the question always is like, okay, where do you draw the line, right? Like what are those values? And you're immediately in the realm of political philosophy when you ask that question, right? You're in the realm of designing governance. Private governance is still governance.
So what is your line? Like, where do you think it's important to have trust and safety, and where it went over your line?
So look, I think so. First of all, it's complex, and it's complex for many reasons. So it's complex for several reasons. So one of which, look, these are very big picture questions overall. These are core questions to how the structure of a political, association. These are big structures, big questions on the structure of society. These are big ethical and moral questions, and so it's very complex there. And then in the context of companies specifically, it gets even more complex because companies, at least in theory, are private actors, right? And private actors, private actors can have more restricted domains than public actors, right? And so, just as an example, freedom of speech. Well, this the big debate that plays out on campuses right now, but simple example would be freedom of speech. You can have freedom of speech in the town square to talk about political topics. It doesn't mean that somebody can stand up at a restaurant and just start screaming at people, right? Like the people, the owners of the restaurant have the ability to enforce a more stringent view on speech within the context of a restaurant, right, than society has overall. And it's the same thing with companies, right? Companies have the ability. And look, I've got a 9-year-old, and like I want him to be able to sign up for internet services, and I want him to have like a Disneyland experience, not a. I mean, look, I love the internet free for all. Someday he's also going to love the internet free for all, but I want him to have, walled gardens, that sort of have controls. And so I think there's a lot of latitude by company, to be able to decide this. Again, the Disney example is a good one. Disney imposes different behavioral codes on what happens at Disneyland than what happens on the streets of Orlando. And so I think those are all good and valid. Having said that, when you create internal affairs, when you create a police force that is, responsible for policing actions, and then pretty soon is responsible for policing speech, at some point there's this question of like, okay, how far are you going? How, where does that agenda take you? And I think that, I think it's fine if there's like a diversity of views on this. I think it's fine if there's lots of different choices. If you end up in an environment of sort of pervasive censorship, pervasive controls, I think you have a real problem.
So you want to minimize government regulation. You also want to minimize self-governance from a self-policing.
No, I didn't say that.
You just said.
No, I just said the opposite of that.
You said
I fully support Disney's ability to decide what happens at Disneyland.
I see.
Right.
But even if, I don't mean over-index on Disney, but there is a potential of overstepping. Yeah. Right. So where do you think the governance come from?
Well, I mean, look, it fundamentally has to come from leadership, right? It's always a question of leadership. It has to at the
for individual institutions.
Yeah.
What about the society?
Yeah. So it also has to happen through. It has to happen through. I mean, look. These are very active debates all the way to the Supreme Court right now from a societal level, and there will be a lot more of these to come. Mm-hmm. And then look inside companies. Look, I would describe it as we in the industry are the dog that caught the bus. I mean, look, I'm partially responsible for a fair amount of this. Look, like what happens on these platforms really matters. What happens in these systems really matters. What happens in these companies really matters. Look, I would say if the industry gets winnowed down to 2 or 3 or 4 big companies that sort of get regulatory capture, which is I think what they're trying to do, and if they basically become conjoined with the government, then I think we have a bunch of like really potent societal level questions we have to deal with. Mm-hmm. If there's a competitive landscape, in the out years where there's big companies and there's lots of startups and there's open source and there's academia and there's sort of vibrancy and competition among those domains, then there can be, I think, a lot more flexibility, a lot more different approaches. I would like to sort of see more. I would like to see more sort of, let's say, diversity of style and approach. I think that would actually be a very healthy outcome.
This is where you and I rigorously agree. So to just close, you are here at Stanford. You have been, your whole family has been friends and part of the community. What is your hopes and dreams for Stanford High and for Stanford? Especially we are the world's leading interdisciplinary institute for AI, human-centered AI. What is your hopes and dreams for us and our roles?
Yeah, so start by saying, look, like you mentioned, like it feels like it's the dawning of the age of AI. That's a funny concept because, as you well know, AI is actually an 80-year-old field.
Yeah, but we've been through so many winters.
It's been a long and winding road to get to where we are.
Yep.
Everybody here may know this. This blows my mind. The first paper outlining the theory of neural networks was in the year
1950.
No. Earlier. I gotcha.
Oh my
computer.
God.
I just won the computer bowl. 1943.
By whom?
It was Pitt and the other guy. I forget his name.
Wow.
There's like 80 people in the audience who know the answer. So it was the original neural networks paper was 1943. So there's actually a great book. Thomas Rid wrote a great book called Rise of the Machines, where he goes back and actually goes to the very, very origins. There were actually debates in the 1930s about whether computers should be von Neumann machines, what ultimately became known as von Neumann machines, or whether they should be modeled after the human brain.
Yep.
This is an 80, 90-year-old field. When I was in school in the late 80s, it was after the AI, there had been AI boom in the 80s. There was a very big bust after that, the sort of expert systems wave. And so it's just like, I think it's just like, I don't even know a historical precedent for a field that like basically incubated for that long and then it's like, boom. It turns out it works. I mean, I don't know how big of a surprise. Maybe you always had faith?
Well, I don't know. Like chemistry and physics has always incubated for like hundreds of years before the modern science came in. But you're right. You have a point.
Yeah. And so it's this 80-year overnight success, and which is really quite a remarkable thing. So and look, I bring that up just because Stanford has played a role every step of the way, right? And John McCarthy, was here for a very long time, and the Stanford AI group. There's a very long and rich history here. Stanford and MIT and a handful of other institutions are responsible for a very large percentage of the development that's led to this point. So the legacy here is tremendous. I fully expect that to continue on the technology side, and I think it's the NLP course is it a quarter of Stanford undergrads now?
Yeah, NLP, computer vision, we all have hundreds and hundreds of students. But I can't let you go by asking,
please. Go ahead.
How do you think we're going to make so much progress when we don't even have GPUs?
So, well, step one will be making sure that there's actually software to run on the GPUs. And so I would say part of this is my hope is Stanford stands up for intellectual freedom, academic freedom, freedom to experiment, freedom to innovate, freedom to develop, freedom to deploy. Because I think that's absolutely necessary. Because like if institutions like Stanford don't show up for that, in a field like this, we're in real trouble. So that's one. And then two, look, I think this is an area where the government absolutely has a role, and this is something I talked about in DC a lot. And I'll just say, look, my whole career, you mentioned the internet kind of wave. My whole career is basically a function of government funding. Of
UIUC, supercomputer.
UIUC. So for people who don't know, there were two big government funding bills in the 80s. One to basically fund what were at the time called the National Supercomputing Centers, and then the other was to fund what was called the NSFNet, which we now know as the internet. To connect everybody to the supercomputers, and basically my career exists because the NCSA at Illinois was basically funded by the NSF in a precise analogy to the moment that we have today. The funding in those days was to fund supercomputers primarily for physics and chemistry and biomedical research. Here, there's a very clear parallel need to fund large-scale systems for AI research. I think the receptivity actually in DC is actually quite, I think is fairly positive on that.
Yeah.
And I think we should be somewhat optimistic for it. But again, that assumes that we will be living in a world in which AI research is something that's actually allowed to happen.
Please say that on Tuesday in DC.
I will. Yes.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you.
Good.
Our next session will explore the profound impact of artificial general intelligence on society, with speakers Russell Wald and Tino Cuéllar. Russell Wald serves as Deputy Director at Stanford High and previously held the position of Director of Policy. Tino Cuéllar is the President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a visiting professor at Stanford Law School, an advisory council member at Stanford High, and a former Justice of the Supreme Court of California. His work focuses on public law and policy, addressing critical issues such as immigration, administrative law, and the role of courts in society. Cuéllar's diverse experience bridges academia, government, and nonprofit sectors, contributing to his leadership in international peace and policy. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers to the stage.
Well, thank you, everyone. I cannot think of a better person to follow the last conversation where we have a former law professor, a former California Supreme Court justice, head of a prestigious think tank focused on international peace, and also done numerous scholarship on AI yourself. So,
And
Tino,
you forgot a friend of Fei-Fei and John's.
a friend of Fei-Fei and John's as well, absolutely. A friend of High's. So we just heard from Marc Andreessen that his view is a better pathway to have all the benefits of AI will come from a more laissez-faire approach to regulating these systems. And do you hold that same belief?
Well, let me first say thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, Russell, and to all of you. How many of you were here when High was launched? Raise your hand if you were. Okay. I was here. It's been a wild ride. It's been an incredible 5 years for this organization. I feel very proud of what it's accomplished. And I think it's also fair to say that all of us who've lived through the last 5 years cannot say that we would have predicted how this turned out, what followed GPT-2 and then GPT-3, how it is that the White House got engaged, how this created an incredible degree of geopolitical conversation, how India's talking about sovereign compute. So I would just start with maybe a broader frame to answer your question. I would say, how can we understand that in some ways AI is different because it's about the core feature that makes human beings rule this planet, intelligence. But at the same time, it is not the first or the last technology humanity has ever dealt with. I drove over here in a car. I think about nuclear weapons at my day job at Carnegie. I have benefited enormously, like all of us have, from the internet. I see and wonder how penicillin still to this day has an impact on human health. And ultimately, to my mind, the real question is how, day in, day out, can we give humanity the benefits of these extraordinary technologies that are being developed here in Silicon Valley, in California, and around the world, and at the same time learn a little bit from history. What does history tell us? I would say history tells us two things. The first thing is that almost nobody benefits from being a Luddite, from rejecting technology because it's unfamiliar, because it doesn't seem to fit our preconceived notion of how to solve a problem, because we simply want to protect jobs. By the same token, it generally is not the case that you can simply let the technology run wild and not think a little bit about these difficult questions about what happens when you can't predict the outcome, but you can anticipate a couple scenarios. And I'll give you one small example. Anybody who tries to argue to me that fossil fuels have been, on balance, completely harmful to humanity, I think is ignoring most of human history. We are living in a building, sitting on chairs with materials that are built in part from a fossil fuel economy. But the way we have approached the fossil fuel discussion and how we've engaged with fossil fuels over decades and decades and billions of individual decisions has almost backed humanity into a corner, right? So it just seems to me that the real question is ultimately, what are the sensible guardrails, reasonable policies, use of the common law, so we don't reinvent the wheel, but at the same time we don't pretend that a completely unregulated market always solves every problem.
So essentially, we're talking about trying to find a sweet spot here of having a degree of guardrails, but still allowing for vibrancy and innovation. What is that? How do we get there, particularly with the technology that is moving so rapidly that it is, as you just noted 5 years ago, has even surprised some of us in this room who were prescient and had some foresight, but it's very difficult to have foresight with this technology.
I think it has a lot to do, first of all, I mean, this is one place where I caught a little bit of the previous speaker's discussion, and I would say, I myself am not a fan of the precautionary principle in most contexts, and I'm not a fan of it here for a very simple reason. This will get me to answer your question. And that is, it is a very difficult thing to ask anybody, private sector or a government agency, to say, we're going to let this technology be used now because we've decided it doesn't create harm. The reality is that just about everything that humans use, whether it's a car, electricity, fossil fuels, creates a balance of harm and benefit. And ultimately, the starting point of the discussion for me is trying to engage with both the harms and the benefits. The second point of the discussion has to be understanding what the landscape already provides for. We live in a common law system. It's not perfect. But what does it mean? That means that if there's not a single regulation from Washington, D.C. governing a particular technology, that doesn't mean that you can freely deploy the technology if it's going to badly hurt somebody. It doesn't mean that you can make a contract about that technology without taking into account the rules of contract. It doesn't mean you can ignore the criminal laws. In those existing legal provisions are often the answer to a lot of hard questions. Questions like, how do we balance the benefits of all these autonomous vehicles with the harm that they might do when they don't recognize somebody crossing a crosswalk, like a little kid crossing a crosswalk? So the second point is recognizing we have a lot of laws in place already, right? And the question is just, like a scalpel-wielding scientist, where and how do we need to add or maybe tweak what is there? The third piece of it is to recognize that there are going to be some things that are special about this technology that perhaps call for a little bit more learning on the part of government. And I use that word learning on purpose because I don't think anybody can expect government to know everything before it intervenes. But by the same token, it's important to recognize this is changing so quickly and affecting so many people that you don't want a licensing regime that chills the development and the use and the experimentation with this technology. Much better to build on the common law with some very specific rules, for example, about medical devices. Many of them already on the books, just need to be implemented. And then to ask, how are people using this and what blind spots are we seeing that require further attention?
So if I'm hearing you right, would you say that there's a lot of existing laws that we can actually rely upon to help us, but at the same time, there will need to be new laws to keep up with this moment? However, what I do see often, and you use the word scalpel, and I think that's an appropriate word here. The problem is when I look at this, the U.S. Congress is a one and done place, right? They don't go back a year later.
You're going to ask me to defend the U.S. Congress?
No, I'm not trying to say that. I'm trying to say, when that time comes, how do we get that type of law that allows flexibility for others, because there will not be an opportunity, most likely a couple years later, once there is some type of regulatory aspect?
Well, first, I'm going to reluctantly agree with the premise of your question, which is like, I'm not about to give up on democracy. I don't think many people here are. But, when I used to teach administrative law here, I would teach a class about a particular piece of legislation called the Delaney Clause. How many of you have heard of the Delaney Clause? Okay, well,
not many.
In the last month, you've probably eaten foods that had food additives. That's okay. Some food additives make food safer. The problem with the Delaney Clause is that something that sounded super popular to members of Congress was to implement a twist in the law that would say any detectable concentration of carcinogens in a food additive should lead to the non-use of the food additive. What's the problem? Anybody in this room can spot the problem, and that is every single year, the technology to detect carcinogens improves. So you're effectively setting up a standard that backs you into a corner, again, because many of these food additives have benefits, but no legislator wants to say, I would like to be the one to introduce this bill to allow more carcinogens that are detectable in the food, right? So I'm accepting that often it's very difficult to ask Congress to get the legislation just right. There are two things that help. The first is that a whole bunch of existing law, again, already rests some authority either in the courts or in administrative agencies, and neither the courts or the administrative agencies are perfect. I've worked in both. But that existing authority does allow a more sensible process, the kind of process that if we were to sit down and spend 10 minutes asking, what do we expect from government when it's at its best? And it's often not at its best. But when it's at its best, I would say it combines a democratic impulse. What does the public want? A bunch of scientists thinking hard about what can actually be done, and the folks, often lawyers, but not always, who are asking about what's fair. Like, if somebody disagrees with this, can they go to court? Can they ask for review? And when all those three things happen, they often do in agencies, you get something a little bit better. So I guess part of my answer is that occasionally Congress rises to the occasion, does some pretty good things, but often we have to start with the mix of scientists and pragmatic people inside government, trying to get this right, not wanting to kill industries, not wanting to completely chill innovation, but wanting to make sure that the responsibility they have for keeping the people safe is not completely ignored.
Okay, so the last fireside chat had a similar question here that I'm going to pose to you, because it is this really major area that policymakers, the AI community, academia is grappling with, and that's open source. And as you well know, open source software systems are not only the foundation of our digital economy, but also have allowed for academia and startups to participate in software development. And at the same time, we see concerns around misuse, such as deep fakes, voice cloning, child pornography. What's the right balance to ensure we are mitigating these negatives and can have this vibrant open source community?
So I'm going to get more specific here because I have the benefit of a gathering that Carnegie organized a few weeks ago. And I will say, just like little note to self, if you want to get a bunch of super busy people who are very intense and who often disagree with each other about something pretty foundational, because we had people ranging from Meta and Luther to Anthropic, and a bunch of academics who are deeply concerned about open source. But note to self, the best thing to do is take them to Bellagio next to Lake Como and give them a couple of days to hang out. It's pretty cool. And I have to thank our friends in the Rockefeller Foundation for making that possible.
They've been great.
By the way, a little aside, when I see the numbers from the Rockefeller Foundation about the percentage of their expenses that are administrative, I sometimes raise my eyebrows a little bit, but then now that I've been to Bellagio, I understand a little better. So what did we talk about at Bellagio? After 3 days with, former cabinet official, folks from the private sector, cutting edge academics, 3 things became pretty clear. First thing, it's important to disaggregate what we're even talking about when we say open source. I think, if there's one thing that I would like to get through in this whole discussion about regulation, the rule of law, and AI, it's like, take the labels and the buzzwords and interrogate them hard. And open source is a good one, because if I go back to the open source software movement, which was referred to in the previous talk, we're talking not only about letting you see the code, letting you play around with the code, but those of us who have been involved in technology for a while also know that there was something else too. There was generally a licensing regime that was pretty flexible, that will let you do stuff with that code, right? So we have to differentiate between sharing model weights, open weight, and actually open source in the sense that you can do anything you want to with them. And I would just note that the very big investments that some private sectors players have made in developing models that have elaborate capabilities, let's say GPT-3 level, GPT 3.5 level capabilities, and are open weighted, open accessed, often come with pretty detailed licenses that say what you can and you cannot do. What does that tell me? That tells me that one part of this discussion is going to go in the direction of new business models that are going to be about sharing the model weights, encouraging people to put them in their servers and integrating them in their software. But if you upload them to a cloud provider, then somebody might have to pay to somebody else, right? So I just note that we ought to just look beyond the labels. That doesn't help. The second thing that came out of that Bellagio gathering is that there are some cutting edge techniques. In fact, some faculty here at High are working on them. We had somebody from Princeton, a former Stanford CS and law student, who's now a faculty member at Princeton working on this too, Peter Henderson, who's a High friend as well.
Done great work, yeah.
And he and others were sharing that there are increasingly techniques where you can refine the models to the point that you can embed the guardrails and the capabilities so broadly in the model that if you try to engineer out the guardrails, you're also degrading the capability. This feels important to us because it feels like, for my Carnegie colleagues and me, the binary of are you for or against open source is doubly wrong. 1, because you got to look at the details of what the license allows. 2, because there are some technological fixes. Third point, while it is true that we should not assume that closed models are completely safe, they can be stolen. You can thwart the API. Anybody here has played around enough with the APIs can find ways to get around the guardrails, talk about how you're writing a play or whatever. That doesn't mean, this is the last consensus point, that we can ignore some of the distinctive challenges that arise with something that's fully open-weighted. And there, I think we've got some work to do, because I think in everything I've said, this is kind of a long answer to your question, I'm not against open weights, open source, open access, but I do think at a minimum, we ought to develop better monitoring tools so that we know to a first approximation when somebody who really means harm is trying to engineer out those guardrails and then figure out what the right response is.
But even still with that, I think there's going to be this struggle if you're a policymaker right now and you are hearing from your constituents that they received a phone call at 3 a.m. that their college daughter was kidnapped out of her bedroom, and while she was actually sleeping fine and she's screaming for a ransom. That is going to create a lot of social disruption and harms through this, and therefore it might make policymakers force their hand in a certain way. How is it that the open source community, beyond some of these technical areas, can quickly adapt to that to be able to stop and mitigate these risks?
Two things. Number one, the more we get people who have some experience on the tech side inside government, the more we change the culture so that there's a little bit less of a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yep.
And that's, a whole of society approach here. I think it's a high issue. It's some of the Carnegie fellows we have. It's people who have spent time in the private sector, done very well, and now want to give back in some way. Second, though, I do feel like it is a really useful thing to do to ask, if one thing is an overcorrection, think the Delaney Clause again. Like, was there a problem with carcinogens in foods? Yes, there was. Could government do something a little bit more targeted to get the benefits of these food additives and at the same time reduce exposure to carcinogens? Absolutely, right? So it's taking the hard task on of going beyond the labels and the slogans, and it's the work that HI is doing sometimes to put out one of these policy briefs saying, here's the way you split the difference actually and do something more sensible. And I can tell you, not everybody in government will listen, but I've been around government enough to tell you there's always some chunk of people inside, often folks who come in with experience in other walks of life, who will be strong advocates for a more sensible middle course. And another piece of that puzzle is that the conversation is increasingly global. So you have to think not only about how does this play out in the US, but how is the UK, France, India? These are all, I'm using these countries specifically because they all have somewhat different views on this open weight, open source stuff, how to leverage that disagreement in a sense to get better policy.
Well, can I pull on that? I think I have a few more minutes to pull on thread just because the international role that you have now, leading this think tank that has international reach. We talk about the open source sometimes a little bit too much in the way of a US-centric perspective, as if we think we could solve it exclusively here. What is the wider aspect of this in the international arena and what we would need to do to make sure that we put on similar guardrails, not just from a US-centric?
So you're going to hear my defense of casting aside the precautionary principle and leaning into the benefits of this technology as a way of then getting to why I think it is quite reckless to say, regulation is a problem, this should all be laissez-faire, which I think is a real mistake. For most of you who have been to emerging powers and developing regions, you know that most of what we take for granted here in the middle of the Stanford campus is not available. The ability to go to PAM for someplace like that when your kid has a problem. The ability to get access to a terrific tutor when your kid has a problem. The ability to find a way to get access to a lawyer when somebody's trying to kick you out of your home, or when, your livestock is dying because of some chemical that was dumped. When I think about the legitimate aspirations of billions of people around the world to have access to all of that, I see a real delta between how those aspirations are met and the model we have right now, which is about training doctors, lawyers, and teachers to just go out and find some way of filling that delta. I think it is going to take leveraging the technologies that are being developed right now with care and finesse. I think it will take getting these countries on board and listening to their concerns about sovereign compute, about tech transfer. But I do think that the world we can live in, if we leverage that technology effectively, is one that will be more interconnected, less likely to go to war, less filled with resentment, and frankly, more the kind of world I think we all want to live in. However, I also think it's true that none of that technology, if it is capable of actually solving medical problems effectively and teaching your kids something that you can rely on, is going to be free of serious risk. And I'm just going to pivot for a moment to the military context. It's just one context, but there are others. The previous discussion referenced the military context too. How could I be against, as an American, a technology that might allow my country to achieve its national security goals and put fewer Americans at risk who are in uniform? I'm not against that. However, there is a bit of an arms race here, and one of the challenges is going to be that the technology benefits of automation, as we're seeing in Ukraine, also come with some gradual, likely erosion of human agency and judgment. And I'll tell you something that really struck me about my years on the court. There's no question in my mind that in any given case, sometimes the case can be so routine and so technical that a pretty well-trained generative model could do as well as one of my colleagues on the court. Notice I said as well as one of my colleagues on the court. But what did it mean for somebody who was facing a 25 to life sentence to have somebody judge their case? I think what it meant is that there was a kind of a moral and ethical piece to some human being saying, I know this is hard, and I know you're going to disagree with me, and I know you're going to suffer for this decision, but I am personally taking responsibility for it. Now, Max Weber, I don't know if Max Weber's been mentioned here much. He's hard
today,
to read,
at least,
right?
yeah.
And I mean, he sometimes doesn't make sense, and he led a life I can't fully defend. But he was brilliant, and I think what he cautioned us, for those of us who are interested in both AI and organizations, is it is not a good thing to have an organization, a bureaucracy, whether it's a private or public sector one, where the end point is that people can evade responsibility and say, I don't know why this got decided, like the system did it, right? And I think what we need to understand, even as we lean into all the new that comes with AI, is recognizing in some way it's restating an old problem, which is how do we get the benefits of diffusing decision-making? So no one human is making the decision about whether this particular person wearing this particular piece of clothing is about to get killed by an automated drone, and at the same time to get the benefit of protecting lives. I view that as a worthy problem, right? Notice I'm not saying, oh, human in the loop has to mean that X, but I do think that the question is a hard one, and I just worry about treating it as an easy question.
Okay. So I want to pivot a little bit over to the fact that you have a history in academia. You remain very committed to academia. Just in the green room, you were saying how this is your first year in 20 years not teaching?
First 2-year stretch, not teaching.
Okay, yeah. And so as you may be well aware.
By the way, I miss the teaching. I don't miss the student evaluations, to be clear.
I think there's quite a few faculty members in here who might agree with that. As you well know, though, academia is at risk of falling behind in frontier AI.
Oh, I think it's fallen behind.
Yes.
I mean, why are we talking about at risk?
Well,
I mean, let's be
I'm trying
totally
to be
honest. Right?
Absolutely it is. And we have data that shows that now. So what is it that the university system itself needs to do to prepare for the future of AI? Hi's done a lot of work on public sector AI. It's a very important part of our role in our mission. But at the same time, the government may not be able to save academia here. It's going to require the academy to be introspective and make changes to adapt to this moment. What does the university system need to do?
I can imagine two things we can do, and then I'll have a kind of a footnote on it, which is both, to my mind, an intriguing and encouraging thing, but also raises a lot of questions about how to think about the future trajectory of the technology. So one thing we can do is blur a little bit more of the barrier between, what side of like Palm Drive are you on, to the degree that right here in our community, and Hi, I think, is at the leading edge here, but I think the transformation of the university is not complete, that we have tenured professors, we have postdocs, we have grad students who want to be professors full-time, but we also have people from industry. We have people who are coming out of government and want to understand this a little bit more. We have people from the civil society sector, but are as much at the cutting edge of tech as they can be. But in particular, that we have folks who have that private sector knowledge who can be part of these conversations. Because let's be honest, there are some guardrails we need. Some of them are already in the common law. Some of them are going to be about frontier models applied to really dangerous tasks, like critical infrastructure. I don't want an open, weight open access model that's been transformed in 20 or 30 different ways, controlling the electric grid without a lot of testing, to be clear. But many of these tasks are not going to be possible to do inside government, nor should they be done in government. There has to be a robust third-party ecosystem to test these models. And inside the companies, there has to be, to my mind, a culture of innovation, but also honesty. I wouldn't say testing or caution, just honesty. Because most of the time, if you're a CEO, you want to say to the public, use this. It's great. Pay money for it or don't pay money for it, but use it. Why should you use it? Because it's actually going to leave you better off. And those claims sometimes ought to be tested, right? And to my mind, that is going to require a blurring of that distinction. I think the second piece, which leans into the high labs, is partnerships. Beyond simply having the people around, having agreements that allow for sharing of the GPU infrastructure so you can have teams of scholars doing curiosity-driven research at the cutting edge. I do think there are legitimate questions about how much of that you can have before it really changes the true character of the university. I'd lean into those, just like I lean into the human in the loop piece with the military. But I think in principle, we have to do more of that. Here's the question in my mind, though. The premise of all my answers highlight that GPU access, cluster access, is the real choke point for frontier innovation. I think that is true at the moment and will probably stay true for a little bit. But there's a lot of research that's beginning to emerge, some of it from DeepMind, some of it, if you follow the papers in China, about how much closer to the frontier you can get if you actually take smaller clusters of units and units that are not quite at the cutting edge NVIDIA unit level, and string them together in clever ways with the right software. So I do think we have to challenge our intuitions and ask ourselves, what is the world going to look like if it turns out that the hardware piece of this gets a little bit more commoditized than it looks right now? Now, I think a totally legitimate rejoinder to me is like, look at the valuation of NVIDIA. And do you have anything to say about that, Tino? And I would say, well, I'm not sure I have an answer to that. But I do think part of our role in rooms like this is to imagine futures that may not have a 50% probability of happening, but actually are a little bit more likely than we might expect.
That's great. Well, everyone, please help me give a round of applause for Tino Cuéllar.
Thank
you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Dean Jonathan Levin. John Levin has served as the Philip H. Knight Professor and Dean of Stanford Graduate School of Business since 2016, and will start as the next president of Stanford this August. He is widely recognized for his scholarship in microeconomics and industrial organization. He received the John Bates Clark Medal, which recognizes outstanding American economists under the age of 40, and currently serves as a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. So please join me in welcoming Dean Levin.
Great, so it's terrific to see so many people here, and thank you to that wonderful voiceover introduction. It's going to bring you around wherever I go. This is a real joy to be here at HAI's 5th anniversary, and to see this room packed and people sort of even standing in the back rows. 6 or 7 years ago, I was part of a group of faculty and friends of the university that met every month or so at Bob King's house to start thinking about the ways in which advances in machine learning and the availability of data, the sort of revolution that had happened with neural networks, was going to impact the university and also the world. And HAI was one of the key things that came out of those discussions. And at the time, it was an idea about what we might do at Stanford to be at the forefront of this new breakthrough in science and in technology, and to be at the forefront of convening people to think about the implications and how society would navigate the changes that were coming. And so it's incredible, after 5 years of HAI, to see that under the leadership of John and Fei-Fei and James and others, Eric Brynjolfsson and many of the faculty who've been involved, the great staff who work here, many across the university, the advisory board, and all of the friends of HAI who are gathered here today, that in fact, we have been at the forefront of those things. And to see the work of the faculty in the research that's going on here is just extraordinary. The thinking about the impact and the ways to guide and shape technology and its regulation is really path-breaking. And then I think probably more than any other academic institution, HAI has been really at the forefront of helping people understand this change in technology, and also helping to influence policy with the NAIR and the sort of research computing at the federal level and so forth. And so it's congratulations to everyone who has helped to do that. It is an amazing, amazing thing. And I was just last week at HAI's California AI Day, and you could just see how much everyone was looking to Stanford and looking to HAI for guidance on thinking about the future. I want to say one or two things just about my excitement about what is coming next for HAI. And you're going to hear more about that later in the day. I think James is going to talk about that. After one of the most impactful things that happened in the United States in the last 100 years was the decision after World War II by the federal government to locate research and development inside of universities and to make a massive investment in science and technology. And the federal government did that after World War II because it saw that for the US to be a leader in the world, we had to be at the forefront of science and technology, and that by putting the engine of innovation and thinking about the forefront of science and technology inside of universities, that would be the best way to do that. And it would be the best way to do that because universities excel at two things. They are better than anywhere in private industry, better than anywhere in the world, and no one is better than US universities at assembling an array of interdisciplinary talent. And universities, American universities, have a fundamental value of openness. They're open to all types of different people, they're open to new ideas, and they give their ideas away. They disseminate their ideas freely out into the world, very different than private industry. And that decision after World War II has been so central, not just to the success of universities like Stanford, but to the success of the whole country, and has created so many benefits for the world, helping to bring prosperity to many people. And we are today at a very pivotal moment, again, where if you look at where the forefront of research and development is in the US, the funding has shifted in many ways largely to the private sector, and in areas like AI, the forefront to some extent is in the private sector as well as in universities. And so we need to find a way in the coming years to ensure that a lot of the best work, the most exciting work, the frontier, will be happening here at places like Stanford. And HAI, of the many things that are going on, is going to play an incredibly important role in doing that. And I'm really excited about the way the leaders of HAI are thinking about how we can make that next step, how we can enable incredible advances across all domains of science and really be at the forefront of what is coming with this technology. So with that, I want to say, again, thank you all for being here. It's great. I mean, it really is amazing to see this room full of all these people who are so interested in what is going on here and so supportive of it. Congratulations to everyone involved with HAI. Congratulations to John Etchemendy, to James Landay, and to Fei-Fei as our co-directors for the incredible amount they have accomplished. And it's just a pleasure to be here. Okay, with that, I'm going to introduce the stars of this session. So I'm going to bring up to the stage David Siegel and Fei-Fei Li. And David and Fei-Fei. David is the CEO and David's the founder of 2 Sigma, one of the leaders in applying quantitative methods to finance. Fei-Fei is our iconic AI faculty member who has been the visionary and the director of HAI since its founding. And with that, come on up, David and Fei-Fei.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Thank you.
David, we're between the audience and lunch, so let's make this exciting. And after,
unfortunately, I'm very long-winded.
After John, thank you for the great speech, and very excited that we will continue to collaborate with the incoming Stanford president on HAI and HAI Labs and all the new initiatives. And with that context, this is why we bring MIT trustees to have a conversation. No, just kidding. So you heard about David's incredible accomplishment. You need no introduction. But what you guys probably don't know about David is that his whole career started in AI as a PhD student at MIT's AI lab. So let me just start by asking, and you told me it was in robotics, right?
That was primarily, yeah.
Yeah, so How did you go from robotics to finance, and what's the intellectual link there?
Well, it turns out it's really almost the same problem. Probably, and I'm not really even joking. What I'm interested in, have been interested in back then, before the term even existed, was essentially embodied AI. And I agree with the earlier comments that were made today, which is that one of the key parts of human development is, or any kind of evolutionary development of intelligence, is that there's a constant interaction with the environment. Doing some sort of intelligence in simulation is actually challenging for the following reason, because you got to first make the simulator, and you have to make convince yourself that you're simulating what you really care about, which is pretty hard. So the advantage of robotics is you don't necessarily simulate. You're just launching your AI on the real environment, and that then is in a way a harder problem, but it's a more realistic problem, and it's more representative of how we have evolved over the years. Now, when I was done with my MIT work, I was interested in trying to find AI-style problems that allowed me to do things that interacted with the real world. And back then, long ago, the stock market, in a way, the investment world, is alive. It's essentially an organism. And when you develop algorithms that interact with the investment world, that's not something you can simulate it to some extent, but it's really an organism and a living thing. And so I thought that the problem was very intellectually interesting.
So when we were talking offline about this, you actually made a really interesting comment about data, because data is essential for today's AI revolution. It's part of one of the most important elements of making AI happen. And you said in your work, data also plays a huge role. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, data is very interesting. So people have used data for years in a range of scientific disciplines. And data has been used for weather prediction. So data is nothing new, and people have been building models to use data to make predictions. In a way, there's a dichotomy where you can build a deterministic model, or you can do something empirical, and you can fit something to the data and make predictions off of it. And they both have their roles in the world, but for sure in investing, people have done in a way both. They have done model building with historical data, and they have also tried to reason. This is more of a human style, reason about something to make an investment decision. That has gotten me to think a little bit about the process of reasoning versus prediction. And there's a lot of talk about that earlier today. And I've concluded that it's a much more complicated question than many people might believe, in that we can easily mix up reasoning with data prediction. So for example, if I have a model that predicts the weather for next week, entirely data-driven, if no one knew about how I did that, and I just said, hey, I'm reasoning about the weather, and using my reasoning process, I came up with a forecast, you'd say, oh, okay, there was some kind of logical, just like in investing. If I think it through, and well, here are all the logical reasons why I think I should make this investment. Okay, that's one approach, but another approach is you just build a model and you get to the same decision, or something in between. So I think that there's a continuum, and it's not obvious, for example, to me, when for example, an AI model is making a prediction, is that actually just simply another, essentially fancy version of regression? or is it inherently different and some form of sophisticated reasoning? And so, and I think this is more than just an intellectual question, because it kind of gets to the root of intelligence. And we may be a little bit mixed up. It may turn out that intelligence has a lot more to do with just finding patterns in data and making predictions off of those patterns. It's not the whole story, but that form of intelligence, if you wish, is actually proven to be very powerful.
So are you saying that the difference between prediction and reasoning is really the explainability?
Well, it could be, but I'm suggesting that we don't really understand. Well, we understand prediction very well. Everyone understands, for example, a regression model, but it's the reasoning that we don't understand all that well. Okay. And so, so I'm wondering how important, and this is for the future of AI, how important is it to actually develop a reasoning ability that is different from essentially a data modeling ability?
I don't know if you were at our first panel, actually, a group of interdisciplinary neuroscientists and computer scientists actually talked about that, especially indexing on humans' development and cognitive ability. Really, things like explainability is a major part of that.
Yeah, well, one of the problems is that it is very hard and maybe impossible to explain something that is purely a data, like to explain a model based on regression. What do you say? There's really no explanation, and it works because it works, and that's that. And so, to some extent, it may become very difficult. The explainability question is actually, to me, not obvious, because if we're trying to explain essentially the output of a numerical method, I mean, the best explanation really is, well, here are the equations, and like we can explain how large language models work. We can explain, but the explanation isn't necessarily what people are looking for. Yeah. We know how they work completely, but yet that's not satisfactory to people. But actually, there may not be, that great an answer ever, just because it's essentially highly numerical in its formulation.
So let me change the topic a little bit, because one of the reasons I find our conversations fascinating is that your career and involvement, interaction with the world is not just in industry, not just in the financial world. You actually have played, continue to play a role in higher education and academia. You serve on the MIT's, what do they call?
The corporation.
The corporation trustees. And there's a lot of fanfare right now about AI in industry, especially because of the large language model. And the fanfare tends to look into the greatest and latest models and the benchmark numbers and how they can, drive towards some kind of revenue or those. But you actually spend a lot of time thinking and talking about a more long-term impact of AI towards scientific discovery. And you also have the vantage point of, serving on the trustees of higher education. Can you explain to the audience that why do you think that's so important, especially when it seems like the rest of the world is really focusing on these industry-grade, large models?
I'm very passionate about this because I believe if we do this the right way, we can turbocharge academic research across pretty much every discipline. And if we don't go about it the right way, we're going to hold back broad-based scientific advancement. So I would characterize it the following way. The problems that industry works on, by their very nature, there are some exceptions, but these are things where they're pretty direct commercial application. The range of problems that industry tackles is really quite narrow compared to basic research that would go on at a university, and so I believe that to have progress in society, and I agreed with Marc Andreessen, it's a triangle, but the academic portion of it is very, very important. And it's not just about generating better AI models. What it's about is every academic field that exists at Stanford or MIT or elsewhere, material science, chemical engineering, the list goes on, environmental challenges, medical challenges. All of these fields can be transformed by the algorithmic advances that we call AI. But sometimes people say, okay, give me examples of like a problem and how you would apply it. I think that question's a bit of a trick question, because imagine in 1950, when computers came to be somewhat affordable, someone said, how will computers transform research at Stanford? And the answer is, I don't know, but it's probably everywhere, and we better hurry up and give researchers at universities access to the computers. Same for the students. How should the students have access to computers and know and expand their horizons with this new technology so they can become creative and invent things? Absolutely. And so the question isn't, in my mind, what are the problems specifically that we should be focused on for the academic world. It's about how can you get, by the way, I should talk about the term AI in a moment, but how can you get AI infused into all the fabric of research in a university, the same way right now people take computers for granted. You don't think about it. Researchers just have computers. The problem with AI for the academic world, as you said earlier, there's also the data component. And so it's not just getting PyTorch and saying good luck, or getting a couple of GPUs and often it's, do you have the data? Is the data in a format where the research can be conducted? So there's a whole new host of engineering problems that need to be overcome to make research productive. And so today, what I think the problem is that maybe people will get their GPUs, but I don't think that things are set up in a way that they can be as productive as they should be.
Well, first of all, hold that thought on GPUs. I might disagree with you, but let's assume we have GPUs. I want to hear more about, are we adequately prepared to do the kind of AI science that you hope academia does? Because this is so new. It's coming at us like a tsunami. Let's just talk about America. America's higher education, universities like MIT, Stanford, properly structured to answer to this new era of AI?
I don't think in the academic world, I think we're not properly prepared for numerous reasons. But I'll give you one example. It's the interdisciplinary question, because often to achieve these results, you want to combine the skills of computer scientists with the skills of material scientists. The nature of research in universities has become far more interdisciplinary than ever before. And departmental structures in universities, the traditional departmental structures, are not necessarily perfect for this more interdisciplinary form of collaboration. So there's a structural issue.
We have an incoming president sitting right here. Should we get rid of our departments? Is that what you're saying? I don't know who's clapping here.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm not going to weigh in on that, but...
You just said that it's not properly structured.
Adjustments are needed. I'm not the kind of person that wants to take the wrecking ball out. So I think an evolution is needed. And clearly, I think, look, universities recognize the HAI effort is interdisciplinary by its very nature.
Thank you.
I think people do recognize that, pretty much everything in this world is becoming interdisciplinary. And I think that adjustments at universities are needed. Their efforts, even at MIT, the Schwarzman College of Computing project is at its heart interdisciplinary.
So let me ask you, because a lot of people recognize this as a civilizational time because our business is changing, our industry is changing, our technology is changing. Obviously, higher education and public sector needs to be changing. Some of your friends, some of your colleagues have also started to experiment with different organizational structure to do interdisciplinary science. Some are in AI, some are in mathematics.
Yeah.
So what is if you have a magic wand, I want to ask you this because you are deeply in higher education. What would be your recommendation of how we do the new era of interdisciplinary AI right?
Well, so one of the challenges in the academic world is, and related to the departmental structure, it concerns, for example, everything at a university is designed around departments, including the tenure process. Publications tend to be in a particular field. NSF grants tend to be issued in a particular field. Nothing is really fundamentally set up as interdisciplinary at its heart. And so I think the academic world has to look very carefully at, it's a systems problem, has to look at the academic system, and it needs to evolve. And so, for example, if you have an interdisciplinary program combining computer scientists with, let's say, material scientists, what does academic excellence mean? Because people here who are from the academic world will understand that in the past, interdisciplinary, that word often meant you're not that good at either, and which then causes a tension. And pursuing a career in academia, it's a career. You need to, for example, get tenure and so forth. And so the process of getting tenure, in general, leans toward traditional department structures. So I think the system needs to be examined.
That's great to hear from someone who is actually in the system and leading. So I'm coming back to GPUs. Because I actually asked that question to Marc in the earlier panel. He dodged the bullet. He said, ask the government, basically. It's true. I think HI has been leading the effort for working with the US government, including, we have rallied our friends at MIT and many other universities to try to set up this national AI cloud and data repository. But one of the biggest challenges right now in academia AI, whether it's interdisciplinary or not, is the lack of compute. And this is really a pain we feel, right? My own lab has 0 latest generation GPU, 0 in Stanford. So how do you think we address this? Okay, asking government is one of the solution, and we're working really hard. HI is very proud we're leading that effort. But what else can we do?
Well, one effort that I've been involved with is the Empire AI effort. Some of you may be aware of that, in New York State, which had the backing of the governor and essentially is a public-private partnership to commit substantial funding, something like $400 million initially, to AI compute infrastructure for universities in New York State. And so I think that there is an opportunity for other states to consider how they could create such infrastructure for the benefit of their
What is the incentive for the private sector when they themselves are fighting for GPUs?
I think that the private sector has good reason to want to facilitate this, because it is actually providing a training ground for the people that they're going to hire. And I do think that they actually recognize this. When I speak to, the people that are, have the GPUs, they recognize this. And I think that the consortium model, so to speak, like Empire AI, is good because it provides essentially buying power, right? So you can make deals and help all the institutions in New York State at once, rather than for companies to have to pick which university they're going to focus on, which can be a political hot potato.
Mm-hmm. So you think that in addition to just federal owning efforts, the private-public sector partnership is critical for this?
Unfortunately, putting all your chips on federal funding basket.
Literally speaking.
Yeah, right. It's my understanding that the research component of the CHIPS Act is an unfunded initiative. They came up with some, it's nice what they came up with, but it's, the money hasn't been appropriated. And so I think that, very sadly, that federal government funding is less available than it has been in the past. It's actually continuing to decline. I mean, I look collectively, we all should try to help convince the government that such funding is very important. But I would add that quite a bit can even be done more at the so-called local level, and we shouldn't give up on that. There's access to philanthropic and corporate funding. So I think it needs to be a variety of different approaches to achieve the kind of funding here. I think one problem is at universities are that philanthropic funding. People are very happy to give money for a building. People are very happy to give money for an endowed faculty chair, but there's not so much of a giving culture for like pieces of equipment like a GPU. So there's an opportunity for universities to perhaps tap their networks by making more convincing arguments as to why GPUs may be more important than buildings.
We can build a building to host the GPUs. You're the best. You clap at the funniest things.
Yeah, I would make one comment. I think one of the GPU issues is that some people take the point of view that it's hopeless because OpenAI has access to billions of dollars of GPUs. There's no way for academia to compete, and so give up. But I don't think that that's actually correct, and I think you would agree that most of the kind of academic research that's being held up now does not require this vast number of GPUs.
Right.
So a modest number of GPUs that is actually affordable at a university funding level would make a huge difference. So I think that there is also this, perfection is the enemy of the good kind of thing, where people are talking about things at a very large scale, and that holds the whole thing up.
Yeah, and the opportunity probably exists by having enough resources, but really creatively finding solutions that doesn't need, 100,000 GPUs.
Yes, and I would add one, and this I think is something I think about a lot. Most of, if you were to look at a company, an AI company, most of the effort that goes on there isn't basic research. It's actually engineering to use their compute resources efficiently. And so this is an issue that needs to also be thought about, because it's one thing to get GPUs, but it's quite another to use them effectively for a problem. And you have to really be a practitioner to fully understand this. In that, put in very simple terms, any of you that have written any software, any even simple computer program, know that you can write it very inefficiently, and it will take a long time to run, or you can write it more efficiently, and maybe you cut the runtime down by an order of magnitude. That will directly translate into how many GPUs you need. So if you write your software effectively or ineffectively, you could need 10 times the number of GPUs. And so the academic world can't just get the GPUs and call it a day. There's another problem, but that, as I mentioned to you, I'm very long-winded. Maybe we can pass up on lunch and I'll keep going. But we have to think about how this software in the academic world will be produced.
Yeah, and let's not forget the brain runs on less than 40 watts. And with that, thank you so much, David.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, everyone.